Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Emotionally Focused Couples Therapy. This is Dr. Diane Gayhart, and I am going to be re-recording my EFT lecture for YouTube tonight, live. So welcome, everyone. And as you are joining, please go ahead, put your name in the chat, and let us know where you are on the planet as you join us for this EFT training. So please go ahead and put your name in the chat. Let me know where you're joining from, and we'll go from there. Hey, Angie from Las Vegas. Absolutely. She's been in some of my classes. Stephanie from New Hampshire. Welcome. Miami, Florida. Atlanta, New York, Cleveland, New Jersey. Now the names are coming in so fast. I can't read the names. I'm just getting the places, and I'm just randomly. Chaminade University in Hawaii. Hi, Alexander. It's one of my former students. Things are Silmar, Los Angeles, New York, Woodland Hills, California, right near me. Love it. British Columbia. Welcome, folks. Great to have you all here. I know that EFT is definitely one of the most popular approaches, certainly in the area of marriage and family therapy, but I would say even broadly in general in psychotherapy. So Florida, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Israel, Orange County, love it. Great to have you all here, Atlanta, Georgia. So, so lots of interest in emotionally focused couples therapy. It is certainly one of the leading approaches in the field of psychotherapy. And so I am so happy to be here with you and to just talk about this very important approach in the field. And as you probably know, emotionally focused therapy really began with a focus on couples. It's one of the two leading couples approaches that have a strong evidence base to it. And so it's very well respected as a couples therapy approach. But in the last several years, it has also really been advanced both in the area of family as well as working with individuals. But tonight most of the focus, most of the research is on the couples, but we'll be talking about all the different ways you can use EFT and this approach that really has revolutionized so much in the field. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you're not familiar with my textbooks, I always like to have a section on, in a nutshell, the least you need to know. I have heard feedback that students who read the textbook love this section. A lot of the professors are like, the least you need to know, really, Diane? But the idea here is let's just start with the big picture, get a sense of what is this approach all about? So emotionally focused therapy is definitely one of the two leading couples approaches, especially in terms of being an evidence-based treatment for working with couples. It is a validated treatment, meaning that there has been research that it gets above average results when you use EFT. So it is very strong evidence base for EFT. Now, so when you look at EFT, especially when you compare it to some other approaches, it is really focusing on the emotional level of the system. And so we are focusing on and conceptualizing what's going on between people, looking at emotions, and it has both an intrapsychic and an interpersonal, meaning it addresses what's going on within the person, intrapsychic, and interpersonal, what's going on between people. It addresses both levels. It is generally considered a brief approach. So 70 to 73% of couples who are in clinical trials. So this is much more tightly focused usually than your treatment as usual. But 70 to 73% get better usually within 12 to 15 sessions, meaning that there's no longer any what's considered clinical distress as it's defined, with measures for couple distress. And most couples, 86% will say that there is significant improvement within 12 sessions. So significant improvement may not meet that threshold for no longer being clinically distressed. So it's got very impressive outcomes in controlled clinical trials, but I will tell you in the real world, normally the outcomes aren't quite this quite this good, but it is still, I would say, one of the most efficient ways to work with couples. And no one told me this in grad school, so I'm going to tell it to you if you are in graduate school listening to this. But generally, people will say that working with couples is probably the toughest work you can do, I would say, in the field of psychotherapy. And so it really, if this is an area you want to work with couples, I strongly recommend you get formal training in an approach like EFT so that you can work with couples, which can be very, very challenging and difficult. So let's go ahead and get started. Oh yeah, so most of the research has been done on couples, and there is more work being done with families and even more recently with individuals. So if you're familiar with my unifying framework for psychotherapy, you know that I synthesize all of the literature and approaches into a single framework, and that there are 4 different levels that approaches can work on, and each level has 2 parts. And so when you look at EFT, what you're going to notice is that the EFT really focuses all of its interventions and conceptualizations on the emotional level of what's going on between people. Now, this doesn't mean there's no cognition or emotion or societal narratives addressed at all. It just means with this approach, you're focusing in on that emotional level. And more specifically, they are very focused in on what they call primary emotions, which are attachment-based emotions. So emotions that relate to a feeling of emotional safety in relationships. So this is the level that EFT really focuses on. And you'll also see, I mean, they do obviously talk about behaviors, but with more so than tracking the interaction cycle like they might in a traditional strategic or structural family therapy approach, or even a CBT approach. In this approach, they're focusing a lot on the complementary patterns, particularly the pattern of pursuer and distancer. I will tell you one of the things I just loved when I first learned about EFT is how I really believe Sue Johnson has taken some of the most difficult concepts in family therapy and really streamlined them and made it easier to use. And so she just says, focus on who's pursuing for connection and who's distancing, the pursuer and the withdrawal. Very classic way of looking at systems, and I think she just really made it more simple. So you're looking at complementary patterns, and the primary attachment emotions, or what the focus is. Now that's, in this approach. So there's a lot less cognitive processing or going into societal discourses. Obviously, there's some of that, but that's not the focus of the interventions and the conceptualization of this approach. So the juice. So the juice, as you will notice in my books, I talk about the juice, which is the most significant contribution that this approach gives to the field. And so I highlight this in all of my textbooks, both in traditional counseling theories as well as family therapy theories. So, to just highlight that no matter what approach you are using, there are core ideas, I think, from each different theoretical model that we all can benefit from. And I just try to highlight that in this section called The Juice. So what Sue Johnson did that was so revolutionary is that she really developed and implemented and applied, and really I would say is by far the leader in applying a model for attachment for adults. And prior to Sue Johnson's work, most of the work around attachment was focused on children, and really children 0 to 5 for the most part, right? It's when we used to talk about attachment with the little kids and their early attachment needs, and really early childhood primarily, somewhat into the elementary years and such. But it was really a childhood concept. And what Sue Johnson did is she really looked at even adults. We have this need for a secure attachment. I sometimes try to explain it to my clients as we're herd animals, and we need to have that safe primary attachment. We need to have the safe little group. And so that is what attachment is. These attachment figures are our little herd of safety, our little tribe of safety. And adults need this just as much as children. We know in the research that, young infants, there's a failure to thrive. There is a failure to literally survive without an attachment figure. And so adults don't die without an attachment figure, but they are not happy, and they certainly are on their worst behavior when they feel that attachment is threatened. So we're all, when we feel that our attachment relationships are threatened, we all get our stress response triggered, and we tend to not be on our worst behavior. And that is often why I would say couples therapy becomes some of the more difficult approach, because it triggers people at such a primal level of feeling threatened in their relationship. Okay. So yeah, and there is medical research that really does support that we need attachment, and that it affects our physical health, our mental health. And so it really is something that we're beginning to understand much better in terms of how adults need this sense of emotional safety. And so, and as you know, as we talk through this, and you will see that I really have come to believe that that adult attachment theory really helps explain why often in our families and couple relationships, it's very puzzling that the people we love the most are often the ones we are most likely to hurt the most deeply, to be the most cruel or hurtful to say some of the worst things in the world to. We will often say things to a loved one, a family member, or a partner that we would never say to a stranger. And isn't that interesting about human psychology? Why do we do that? And I think this theory and Sue's concept of adult attachment really helps us understand that in a way that we can be more useful to our clients. Okay. See folks joining from all over the world. Just saw Jamaica go by. We've got Florida. Awesome, awesome to have you all here. So Sue Johnson has 10 tenets of her related to this theory of adult attachment and adult love. New Zealand coming in, Myrtle Beach. Wow, you got, this is fun. I want to hit Florida, Myrtle Beach, New Zealand. I love it. Sorry, on the side here, I'm seeing where folks are joining from. Kay over McGurra Hills. Oh my God, you're like 5 minutes from me. Okay, I'm getting distracted by all the cool people joining. So hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. So the first tenet is that attachment is an innate motivating force, that we are motivated to be in these relationships, and that secure dependence on another person complements autonomy. It's not, we're independent or dependent, that these two forces, we need both. And it's a both and that we should be looking to balance both a sense of autonomy as well as a sense of healthy interdependence. Attachment offers an essential safe haven, as well as what's called a secure base, and adults need these just like infants need them. And that is emotional accessibility and responsiveness that builds these attachment bonds. So accessibility, meaning people can access you and that you are responsive to them. This is how you build a secure attachment. And that it is fear and uncertainty that activate the attachment needs. Many people would call this a trigger nowadays. They trigger us, right? When we don't feel safe in a relationship, we get triggered, our stress response gets triggered. And when we feel unsafe in our primary attachment relationships, we feel threatened as if our life is being physically threatened. And when you do a lot of couples work, that explains so much. I remember when I really thought about this, I'm like, oh, this is why people can act so terrible in their couple relationships. Because it really does trigger a very kind of primal sense of safety. So the process of separation distress is predictable, and there is a finite number of insecure attachment styles. One is, anxious or hyperactivated. You get anxious when the attachment is threatened. There's avoidant, where you start to withdraw, or if you feel like the attachment's being threatened, to protect yourself, you kind of withdraw. And then there's a combination where you will do a mix of anxious and avoidant attachment. Now, the one thing I will say, and I've started adding this to my textbooks because clinically this is how I experience it. Because we like to say someone's securely attached or insecurely attached, or they're secure or they're not. And I think it's much more useful clinically to say, and to conceptualize it as any of us under enough stress, we will do one of these or three things. We will be anxiously attached, avoidant, or some combination thereof under enough stress. And the question really is, how much threat do we need to activate this kind of insecure attachment styles? So if someone is, easily gets it triggered or gets a sense that triggers are in it, their insecure style, that's when we typically will call them, anxiously attached or avoidantly attached. But even someone who's securely attached most of the time, under enough relationship stress, you will see these patterns emerge. So it's not like, oh, finally, I went to therapy for 5 years and I'll never have an insecure attachment moment in my life. So sorry, you will. Under enough stress, we will all do one of these things. And an interesting thing to notice as a couples therapist, I will tell you, is that most of us have kind of a default style based on what we did as a child. Were we trying to please our parents? Were we rebelling? Were we detached? How do we handle it? And that kind of is our general style. But if you get into a relationship with someone, you may end up taking an opposite style. Like, let's say two people who are anxiously avoidant end up in a relationship together, right? Well, what you can see happen is a person who's normally anxiously attached becomes avoidant to just balance out that couple system. So your style can actually shift a little bit with different relationships. But generally, we have a style that we developed in childhood, and then we bring it into all of our future relationships, our couple relationships, and also in parenting. You will see these same patterns play out often in parenting as well. And part of attachment is we have these working models in our head of have self and other. And then finally, the last piece here is that isolation and loss are inherently traumatizing. And so when you have an attachment relationship, or one of your primary attachment relationships where there is either isolation within that relationship or loss, that will be experienced as a form of trauma. And so even though we are not talking about physical threat to life, when you threaten someone's secure attached base, even as an adult, that is very traumatic. And so this is what this approach is very unique in being able to address this. And I will say I did couples therapy before EFT was a thing. I remember seeing Sue at the first AAMFT conferences, 20 years ago, where it was the new thing. And I will say that this concept of adult attachment really helps, I think helps us clinically get to the heart of especially couple and family issues much faster than before we had this concept. Okay, so let's look at the big picture, which is the overview of treatment. EFT is an evidence-based treatment. It is a manualized treatment for couples therapy. And so it is structured. It is a structured approach. And so there are 3 basic stages. The first is stage 1 is stabilization. And so this is where you're stabilizing the relationship and the couple, and you're establishing a very strong therapeutic relationship. This work is very intense, and you help them kind of talk, understand why we're going to be exploring some of these more difficult relationships. And then you'll be developing a clear case conceptualization. We'll talk about how in just a minute, using attachment theory, using systems theory, actually, and attachment together. And you're going to kind of track that interaction pattern. I think one of the interesting things about EFT is one of the basic premises is that couples, all couples have, basically one basic pattern. There can be some variations, but there's typically, in most couples, there's just one basic negative interaction cycle. How they argue, how they do their tension cycle. And basically the dance moves are very much the same. The content can change from argument to argument to argument, but typically, and we'll talk about some of the variations, but in most cases, you're going to find there's one basic argument they're having over and over and over again. Take any topic, toothpaste, children, money, finances, sex, put it into it, and they're going to have the same type of argument. So what you're doing in the beginning is you're helping to stabilize them, creating safety, in the session, and then understanding and identifying that core pattern. Then in stage 2, once you've done your assessment, you've built a relationship, you're going to go into restructuring. So the couple system, and what's interesting in this phase is that typically, assuming there's a withdrawer in the system, you're going to work by targeting the most withdrawn couple to get them started and working on helping them get reconnected in terms of the secure attachment. But you're helping both partners identify and directly express to the other their unmet attachment needs primarily. So we're really looking at that primary need for connection and secure attachment. And so you're helping each party express to and to identify, express, and receive, and help meet those needs. And then in stage 3 is what they call consolidation, where you're helping the couple learn how to interact, and communicate in ways using these safe, secure, attached relationship patterns and interaction patterns. So you're learning to help the couple maintain that sense of emotional safety so that they can effectively communicate about whatever is going on. So let's look at the therapeutic relationship. And so EFT is a humanistic experiential approach. So similar, in the same school as Carl Rogers, Fritz Perls, Virginia Satir, Carl Whitaker. So like all of these experiential humanistic approaches, the therapeutic relationship is a core component of making the whole approach work. And it is a very emotionally attuned approach. And so there's this very specific way to do this well. And I would say this: if you're interested in learning how to do EFT, you do need to get formal training, especially for how to do the therapeutic relationship, as well as the interventions. But compared to other theories like, let's say, CBT, I think it's easier to pull that therapeutic relationship off without formal training than it is in EFT. So making a connection to therapeutic relationship. So the therapist really is needing to attune to each person's emotions. And so it's a very emotionally intense relationship, and that you have to be willing as a clinician to kind of take off your expert hat and to be very fully present in the room, emotionally present, emotionally attuned. And so really using what they call empathic attunement, which is listening, understanding their experience, and really listening for the emotions as they are talking and really attuning to that and kind of leaning in. And, there's one thing I will say: clients can sense when they are freaking you out with their emotions. So if they have strong emotions and you feel uncomfortable with their expression of emotion, they can feel that and they will pull back. And so to do this approach well, you have to work, I think, do a lot of work on yourself so that you can be emotionally tuned to your clients, and then create that sense of emotional safety. And this is what's really called therapeutic presence. It's really hard to teach. Really can't do it just from a lecture like this, but and that takes a lot of your self-development as a therapist to be able to be that emotionally present in the room. And again, this is something clients feel. It is not something that's just like taught in an intellectual way. So then and so the one thing too that needs to happen in this approach is the therapist needs to be able to emotionally attune to both people in the room, and please wait for this, simultaneously, even if they're really mad at each other. And it's real important. It takes a lot of, I don't know why the word right now is coming to me as emotional maturity, but it takes a lot of emotional discipline and security and understanding and really having compassion for the human experience, right? Because it's very easy to take sides with one half of a couple partner, and that doesn't work in any form of couples therapy, right? So, the therapist is being able to be empathically attuned to both people at the same time, understanding. And I think how you end up learning how to do this is you really begin to understand how we inadvertently, unintentionally can create a lot of suffering in our couple relationships. And when it really sinks in that couples create these patterns together, we just can't blame one person, as easy as it can be sometimes to blame one half. And it doesn't mean there are abusive relationships or where there is, what do you call it, a clear abuse of power. But oftentimes, couples are often creating these interacting action patterns together. And yes, there can be power imbalances, but it's also recognizing how, at least in most cases, that the couple has created this pattern together, and having a lot of compassion for how humans end up doing this over and over and over again, right? This seems to be the default setting, and we have to work hard to avoid it. So there's this whole compassion for the couple, and understanding and having empathy for each person's position in the couple. So if you get a chance to see Sue Johnson and other EFT colleagues at work, but particularly Sue Johnson, she has a very specific way of relating. I like to always, I like to joke, there's a Sue Johnson lean where she's moving in, her voice is low. There is a way to do this work. And it is really important, when I'm doing, live supervision, with students, oftentimes one of the places I have to help them is there's a way of talking to do any type of emotionally based intervention where your voice is slower. You are, Sue Johnson does the lean. And it's slower paced. The tone of your voice is slower. And if you don't have the right vocal pacing, you talk like this, you can do cognitive interventions like this, but you cannot do emotionally based interventions like this. So if you try to talk like this and do EFT, it won't work. I promise you, because when you get in to processing those attachment emotions, those are probably our most vulnerable emotions that a human can have. There's a certain way that you do this. And so she uses risk, I guess, no, risk, there it is. There's an extra I apologize for that, because I always remember. Yeah, so it's risk. So this is how she uses her voice, and in fact her whole body and her language, to help people access these more vulnerable emotions that all of us generally tend to prefer to avoid. So she repeats words and how people are feeling. She uses images, because images can often convey, convey an emotion more clearly than, just an adjective or a word. So, talking about the weight or the burden, or feeling something feels raw, using different images, keeping the language very simple, because when people are processing very vulnerable emotions, you do not want to use lots of complex language and theories. You're using it slow. So she says soft. I would say add to that a lower tone. I add the lower tone to this, and using the client's own words. Like if a client's saying, it just feels like I'm in a dark, hole all by myself, or whatever it is, you're going to use their words that they just gave you to repeat and to heighten their experience, so that the client can fully experience these vulnerable emotions, express them to their partners in a safe environment, so that the couple can work through them. So you want to, understand that the therapeutic relation, there's a very specific style. Okay. So genuineness and acceptance. And so this is something that actually hopefully characterizes, and I think uniquely characterizes, couple and family therapy. It's one thing to be genuine and accepting with an individual. It's pretty easy. It's just you, it's just them, it's one person to focus on. And but being genuine and accepting with a couple or a family is much more challenging. Oftentimes your sympathies will align with one maybe more than the other. But being able to see the whole system and how it works, and understand how inadvertently, with the best of intentions, all of us can create some form of negative pattern. I don't care who you're with, in terms of how we relate and how we respond when we don't feel safe in a relationship. And so it is real important in this approach, like all the other experiential approaches, that there is this real genuineness and acceptance, and that the clients feel like they're having an authentic human encounter. You are right there with them, side by side, and fully human. And they need to feel your presence and your genuineness, when you are working with them, for them to feel safe enough to do this type of work. And so there's really kind of honoring and prizing clients as they are, acknowledging who they are in their fullness, the good, bad, and the ugly, what they're capable of, and still seeing the best in them. It's a very humanistic kind of way of seeing and viewing clients. And it's very important that this very positive, realistic, I would say, view of human nature, and that the therapist is able to just fully embrace that, yes, this is someone who is struggling, they're in pain. When they're in pain, they may not be behaving the best, but understanding that that's what humans do, and that they're here and you're there to help them learn how to manage those really scary emotions when they feel threatened in better ways. So let's look at how they do case conceptualization and assessment in EFT. So the first thing to just know that when you're working through an EFT perspective, you are simultaneously tracking how the individual is processing their experiences, especially their attachment needs, and then interpersonally, how are the partners working, or the family, how are they interacting? What are the patterns in their interactions? So even if you're working with an individual, you're still assessing the interaction pattern. You'll have them describe it. You don't get to witness it, but humans are relatively predictable with some of this stuff. So you will be using this also with individuals to track their interpersonal patterns and to look at how they handle their attachment needs in relationships. The other important distinction in this approach, which you've heard me use, and I'll keep talking about it quite a bit, is a distinction between what's called primary emotions and secondary emotions. Now, in psychology, there's more than one theory that defines primary and secondary emotions. There are different theories that define it differently. So we're going to use the EFT definition for this approach. So the primary emotions are typically, they're referring to your attachment emotions. And so secondary emotions are your emotions about the primary emotions. So you can get angry, or you can be sad, or you can be scared. But often those secondary emotions, right? If you're feeling threatened, you're feeling like you're not good with your partner, you're not good enough, that'd be like the primary emotion. No matter what I do, I can't please you, right? And the secondary emotion might be anger, is what you're going to see on the surface. So secondary is often on the surface, what people will verbally be describing, usually when they walk in the room, and that it is your job as the clinician to work with them to identify those primary emotions, which most of us don't describe when we talk about why we're upset about what just happened with our partner or a family member. And most of us need some help to really even get to the right words to capture that. So in the early phase of therapy, I'm going to focus primarily on couples right here, is that what you're going to be doing is you're going to identify the negative interaction cycle. In fact, when with working with couples, I will try to do this in the first session, get a little bit of history, but this pattern is really key. And so your first few sessions, you are looking at identifying, what's going on when things are in homeostasis, things are normal. There is not tension in the relationship. How does tension escalate in the relationship? What are things like at their worst? And then how do things sort of get back to normal? Now, I will tell you as a couples therapist, this is one of the most important things to assess, is how do things get back to normal? And you have one of two basic answers. One is at some point they're able to talk it through, hear each other, and get back to resolution. The other option is everyone kind of sweeps it under the rug, and we agree to just move on, but we don't talk it through to where both people feel heard and understood. So when you do couples therapy, I'd say 90% of the time, people they're coming to couples therapy because they have been sweeping things under the rug. So hopefully in the beginning, most couples are able to talk things through, get some resolution. You have a few bad fights, people get more afraid to talk and express. And so things just start getting swept under the rug. And so, so what you're listening for when you're listening for that cycle, always pay attention to that. Every once in a while, you get a couple who can talk things through. It's almost like, why do you need me then? But that's real important, you know, to understand, do they ever talk things through? And when was the last time they were able to do that in a relationship? And so you start by assessing the pattern, and then you're identifying the primary and secondary emotions related to that negative cycle. And then, you know, as therapy progresses, the focus really goes on to identifying those primary attachment needs, as well as expressing those, receiving those, kind of having some emotionally corrective experiences around expressing those. And so, and that is really what the middle phase of therapy is focusing on. And so it's, okay, so what you're going to be looking for, and I love how Sue Johnson simplified this. So those of us who got trained in classic old systems theory, we could have an infinite number of ways and roles in the cycle, one of which was pursue withdrawal. It's one of the classic first described interaction patterns in the field of couple and family therapy. But when you think of most couple interaction patterns as who's the pursuer, who's the withdrawer, it just goes so much faster. And there are, of course, many ways to pursue and withdraw. So typically, so this is a classic pattern. Something happens in the couple relationship or family relationship or even a friendship, right? And the security, the sense of safety, right, gets shaken up. So the person who's more anxiously attached tends to pursue to reconnect, because when they feel like the relationship is threatened, they immediately want to reconnect. Any threat is uncomfortable, so they immediately want to reconnect. And sometimes they do it in a soft, gentle way, but the most common way to pursue for connection, I hope you're sitting, I hope you're waiting for this, the most common way, drum roll please, is to nag. It's the nagger. So whoever is nagging is typically the pursuer, and they're trying to reconnect and kind of correct what they see as wrong, but they're moving towards the partner, which is why they're called the pursuer. So please don't think as if this is romantically pursuing someone. Oh, no, no. Typically, the pursuer is pursuing for reconnection, and it most often takes the form, sadly, of nagging. This is why why do we do this to ourselves? We do. So we got to just have compassion for this is how humans tend to do it. So the withdrawer is the one who, when the relationship feels threatened and the pursuer comes to reconnect, they still feel scared and they kind of put up the wall and they distance themselves and they make it harder to reconnect. And then what happens is the more the pursuer pursues, the more the withdrawer withdraws. And of course, the more they withdraw, the more there's pursuit. And then they reinforce each other and create the negative downward spiral, as I like to call it, together. And so, but when you're in the middle of this, you're like, you are nagging. And the other one's like, because you are avoiding me, right? And the way you subjectively experience it, it always feels like it's the other person who started it. It's the other person who caused this, reaction in me. And if you wouldn't do that, I wouldn't do this. If you wouldn't pursue, I wouldn't withdraw. If you wouldn't withdraw, I wouldn't pursue. And it's true. Yes, 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 and yes, and yes. And so that is where you as a clinician need to be able to hold that bigger perspective and to see how the dance gets created together. And it's all these little micro steps in the beginning. It's all so tiny you can hardly tell that it's going on, but before you know it, you get into this negative cycle and it always feels like the other person started it. And so with pursuers, they're typically going to be expressing feelings such as being hurt, unwanted, uncared for is probably the attachment emotions will feel like typically the other person is not sincerely caring for who they are. In contrast with the withdrawers, they're often feeling rejected, inadequate, judged, like no matter what I do, I am not good enough for you. And so the truth is, even identifying attachment emotions, they're so universal that there's just variations on the theme of not being cared for and also not being good enough on the withdrawer side. So Stu identifies 4 basic interaction patterns, negative interaction patterns. And by far the most common one is what we call pursue withdraw. And so this is where one partner, and it is typically the woman, is pursuing, typically looks like nagging, and the man, if in a heterosexual relationship, the man withdraws. So that's the most typical pattern. You will see the pursue withdraw also in emotionally abusive relationships, in which case the pursuing is done typically by the person who would be considered physically or emotionally abusive. So that's, you'll see that pattern too, but there's more of a power difference in those types of relationships. Another pattern you will see, and this is not a good sign, it's called the withdraw pattern. And so this is where there's obviously something happened, there's tension in the relationship, neither person pursues to reconnect. And so typically this was a pursue withdraw relationship, but the pursuer has given up. And that's always bad when the pursuer gives up, because it's really hard to save those, it's much harder to save those relationships. And I think this overlaps John Gottman's research on couples. He talks about the isolation and distance cascade as predictive of marriage. And I think that overlaps with this withdraw. There's isolation, there's distance. Neither one is pursuing to reconnect when tension happens. So, and helping getting a burned out pursuer to re-engage takes a lot of repair, and we'll talk about some more about that repair work. It's usually an attachment injury that needs to be repaired when you see that type of pattern. So never a great pattern. And then we have attack, just like it sounds. So what this is, and this is often a more of an abusive pattern as well, you have the pursuer who is pursuing, often via nagging, and then the withdrawer at a certain point is like, I've had enough, turns around, and they erupt into anger. And so then you end up with a much more aggressive attack pattern. And then you have the complex cycles, which is usually characteristic of trauma. And so this is a multiple, it's a very complex cycle. And what's great about this, well, I don't know what's great about this one. I mean, what happens in this one, the person who's pursuing and one withdraws, and when the withdrawer tries to reconnect, then who was pursuing, they turn around and they start withdrawing. You create this figure 8. And I will tell you, when you get good at identifying this with couples, they all think you're psychic in the first session, because you'll be like, is there an untreated trauma? Is there any type of trauma history here? They're like, oh, how did you know? I'm like, oh, because you do the figure 8. So yeah, okay, so this is what the complex trauma looks like. So what happens here is person A, let's start with person A is pursuing, right? And person B withdraws, so they have that kind of normal pattern. And then what happens is person B at a certain point decides to kind of reconnect. And as soon as they reach out to reconnect and they're willing to reconnect, person A starts to withdraw. So these people will have a longer cycle of arguing, and it's much more complex. And like these arguments take a lot longer. You will spend a lot more time kind of tracking how these move. So yeah, so again, this is a very complex pattern. And so when you see this type of thing, it generally means that there's some trauma that also needs to be addressed in order to help a person be able to develop a sense of secure attachment. So this pursue withdraw is classically called the nag withdraw because often nagging is used, and there's clearly like stereotypes around that. But the pursuing can take many different forms, and men can do it, women can do it, And so just be open-minded for how that kind of pursuing, it can feel like, can we talk, honey? Can we talk? Can we talk? Can we talk? That is another way that pursuing can look. It can be asking lots of questions is how pursuing can look. And so pursuing can take lots of different forms. Classically in family therapy, it was also called the nag withdrawal cycle because it's the most common form that it takes. But be aware that the pursuing can take lots of different forms. And so, so noticing how each person can do it. Now, sometimes with some couples, one person is always the pursuer, one's always the distancer. And in other couples that they can do the same basic dance moves, but it goes in total reverse and they switch positions. So you can also have that type of pattern that you're looking at with couples. So there are different ways that this can all happen, and each couple has its own unique way of doing this. And so your job as the clinician is to figure out what the pursuing looks like, and what the distancing looks like. And normally I'll try to use the words that both members of the couple agree upon to label whatever the pursuing is or whatever the distancing is. They can be putting up walls. It could be, the wanting to reconnect or whatever language they use. Some couples choose to use the word nagging, and I'll go with that if that's what they want to, if they're both good with that. But finding the correct word for what pursue and withdraw is for that couple that they can both agree on. And then your job as the clinician is to really understand those dance moves. So if you didn't know, Sue Johnson does do formal ballroom dance, and so she uses the dance metaphor quite a bit. So another real important thing to assess as early as humanly possible when working with couples is what we call attachment injuries. You can obviously have this also in family systems. And an attachment injury is a very specific type of betrayal. And it's when in a moment of extreme vulnerability, like being pregnant, right? One partner reaches for the other, and the other partner is not there in this moment of extreme vulnerability. I needed you, right, in this moment very desperately, and you weren't there. And that type of betrayal or attachment injury means it is really hard for me to trust you again. And so when you have attachment injuries, you need to go back and repair those first. And, a common form of attachment injury is infidelity. During pregnancy, there can be a lot of attachment injuries just because, the pregnant partner can often be far more needy and the other partner may not quite catch on to the level of need. So you'll see it can be around family of origin. When you align with the family against the partner. So there are lots of different moments in a couple's relationship where there can be an attachment injury. And so you want to assess those and try to identify those. Usually they bubble to the surface. But if you ever find that you're working with a couple and you just can't get them to move forward, go back and look for a moment where really one person felt very betrayed or abandoned by the other. And sometimes they didn't talk about it if they've been together for 30 years. Sometimes they don't mention whatever it seemed so far in the past. But make sure this is really key. And we will talk about, there are actually a very specific protocol for dealing with these attachment injuries. And of course, these can happen with children when they feel like they needed their parent and their parent wasn't there. But these you need to address very specifically and to do specific repair work on these attachment injuries in order to recreate a sense of safety in the relationship. There are some contraindications for EFT. So you don't just, use EFTs. Couples come in, you don't necessarily use it with everyone. So one common place is if there are really different agendas where one person is for therapy and for the relationship in general. Like if one person is like, I don't know if I want to be in this relationship, right? Or one wants to marry, the other one wants to be single. They have different agendas for the relationship. This is not a good time to do EFT if the end goal isn't even agreed upon. Please, for the love of God, separating when couples are in the middle of divorce. I don't know why I've had several of my clients who I've been seeing individually, sometimes they're these therapists who are trying to do couples therapy. It's like, no, there's divorce therapy. If you're in the middle of a divorce, do divorce therapy or do couples therapy. They are different things. And so if one person has decided to leave, this is not a good time to whip out EFT and try to repair attachments. I mean, that's just very confusing. Yeah, I had one client where the therapist was trying to go back and repair every attachment injury, like during this relatively high conflict divorce. I'm like, it was not having good psychological outcomes for my poor client. So when there is an abusive relationship, that typically you would not be using EFT. There are some exceptions. It's a whole different lecture. But generally, if there's, any type of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse going on, and you would not necessarily jump to EFT. You really need to assess whether or not it's appropriate. And then also with untreated addiction, if you have someone who has an addiction and doesn't want to get it treated, it's kind of in denial about it, that may also be an indication that they're not appropriate. So let's look at goal setting. So goal setting in EFT is relatively straightforward. We're going to create secure attachment for both partners. We're going to develop, healthy interaction patterns that really nurture and support each person. And a lot of that is just increasing each person's ability to identify and express in healthy ways their emotions, particularly their attachment needs. So let's look at the doing. Most recently, Sue Johnson has kind of relanguaged. And when I just updated my Mastering Competencies in Family Therapy, I had to redo the whole section because she redescribed it all. So we call it, she now calls it the EFT Tango, which basically, occurs in 5 parts. So the first thing is that, mirroring what's happening in the present process in the room between the couple. I'm helping the couple, she called it effective assembly and deepening. So assembling the emotions, by that, helping the couple to identify, give language to it, feel the emotions and deepen their expression and experiencing of those emotions. Then choreographing engaged encounters. So some of us who are old school, we'd call this an enactment. She used to call it an enactment too, but kind of you're literally coaching the couples through how to have safe, emotionally engaged interactions where they're able to appropriately express their attachment needs, appropriately respond to their partner, and reestablish a sense of safety in the relationship. And you as the clinician, you are choreographing. You are extremely active. This is not, sometimes people, I think they get the sense they've learned some, Carl Rogers, humanistic, and they just think this humanistic is this very almost passive role. You are very active in this approach, I promise you. So if you want to do a passive therapy, this is not it. And you're choreographing, you're very active, very attuned to what's going on in the room. And it's a kind of shaping what's going on with it. You help process the encounter. So you're helping the couple, talk about what they just experienced. And then you're integrating and validating and helping them integrate this new experience into their relationship and their everyday life. It's also individually. So this EFT Tango and the session, this also is individually oriented in terms of being able to help individuals experience what's going on. And so you are then reflecting both those primary and secondary emotions. You're doing emotional validation. And the one thing I do want to say is that when you're validating, you want to be very careful how you validate and from what position you validate, because validation is a way of taking authority in a certain way. And I think it's real important that when we're validating, we're doing it with a very careful attention to the client's, emotional, cultural, gender, religious values and their norms, and not ours, not what's in a theoretical textbook. But we have to validate in a way that really aligns with the client's unique um, personal values and beliefs. And so to be very mindful when we do that, in terms of, well, of course, and especially avoiding things like it's normal to feel this way. Well, yeah, all of that is culturally defined. So being careful in terms, what you want to do is witness what this person is experiencing in this moment, what their lived reality is. And you don't need to norm it to anything. Okay. Just this is what you're experiencing. I hear, I see it. I understand it. And that's what the validation is. And to be careful to not wander off into inadvertently, with the best of intentions, kind of enforcing cultural gender norms that may not be true for the client. So evocative responding, so this is using reflections and questions to help them get in touch with their more vulnerable emotions that most of us prefer to not feel. Deepening the engagement of their inner experience, whether you're working with an individual or with a couple, and then helping them interpret what's going on with their emotions as well. So interaction, so when you got more than one person in the room here, you're going to be doing a lot of tracking that interaction pattern and cycles. So helping, so this is what was going on when things were just kind of neutral or normal. These were the first things that started happening when tension started rising, and what each person was doing, what they were feeling, how they interpreted what was going on, how things escalated, what things were like at their worst, how things kind of get back to normal. So really tracking that, putting it into words, and helping the couple get really good at seeing the patterns. Because one of the things you do is you actually kind of reframe the situation rather than your partner being the problem. That cycle, this negative cycle, is your problem, and the two of you have created it, and the two of you are going to have to work to find alternatives to it together. And so you're trying to get them aligned to relate differently to that pattern so that you can depersonalize the conflict. When you look at, I think the other major leading evidence-based treatment for couples is integrated behavioral couples therapy. And in that approach, they talk a lot about depersonalizing conflict. And I think where those two things overlap, as you can tell, I like to do the unifying framework and looking for the overlap in theories. So if you look how this overlaps with IBCT, it's this idea that rather than my, personalizing what my partner does to me, it's because you don't care, it's because I'll never be good enough for you. Instead of personalizing it, you help the couple develop a unified kind of alliance against this negative pattern, and that helps depersonalize it. It's not that you don't care about me, or that you're doing this to really upset me. It is because we've created inadvertently this pattern together because of our own vulnerabilities, and so we are going to work together to undo this pattern. I think I just said that. Reframing in the context reframing in the context of the cycle and attachment needs. So reframing what's going on as this is what each of us does when we feel like our relationship is threatened. And so when you have two or more people in the room, you're going to be doing a lot of these enactments, restructuring, choreography, whatever you want to call it, where you're helping the couple to turn to each other. You're coaching them, on how to express their needs in healthy ways, how to respond in effective ways to repair the emotional bond and sense of safety in the relationship. So blamer softening is a very specific set of techniques as well. And so what this refers to is typically, one of the two partners, you can have both partners do this. You really can. But often there's one partner who it tends to be more the blamer. It tends to be someone who's in the pursuing role, can often take this form. And so blamer softening can be one of the most difficult parts of treatment. And so working to kind of help that the person who has taken that blaming stance, who often feels like the other person does not care about them. I mean, that's really what's underneath the blaming but whoever's the more critical partner, we're help them soften their stance in words, helping them to use and to soften them so that they're able to express their needs without that harsh criticism. And so you're going to help guide these people using the enactments usually to express the underlying attachment-based needs rather than going for the attack. the criticism, the attack is the real easy street. And so you're going to try to teach them to step into their vulnerable emotions and express those to get their needs met, rather than trying to get their needs met with the attack. And as I always like to point out, it never works, does it, guys? When I'm talking to my, to my clients, that attack and that criticism really doesn't get you to the emotional safety, which ironically in our human psychology is what we're trying to do. But we don't want to be vulnerable while doing that, so we end up doing this attack. So really taking the blamer and helping them to step into and own and express and lead with expressing their vulnerable emotions, rather than going into the blaming or attacking stance. So there is an attachment injury resolution model. Like I said, those attachment injuries have a specific way that they are dealt with. I go into more detail in my Mastering Competencies and my family therapy books on this, but just to give you the broad strokes overview here. It parallels the general stages, but it's almost like a little mini version of EFT that you do just around the attachment. So again, the de-escalation is the first of the 3 phases, where you're having each person kind of share their accounts of the incident, starting with the person who experienced the injury. And also looking at, I thought this was interesting. They talk about their primary emotions as well as their negative models of their partner. Because when you experience an attachment injury, you feel betrayed by your partner, you fundamentally shift how you see them as a human being and as a partner. And so being able to put that into words, how this attachment injury fundamentally shifted how you see your partner. Maybe that's why it's such an attachment injury, because you redefine them differently after this. So that's the first phase. And in the second phase, you're kind of looking at the injury specific primary emotions. So during this moment of betrayal, and you, in this case model, you're starting always with the person who feels betrayed. You would have them express how they felt, how they didn't care, or they're never good enough, didn't matter to you. You help them really put into words their primary emotions. You would help them with blamer softening, or if it's even sometimes it's the partner, blamer, working on the blamer softening, whoever's doing it, and then begin facilitating the apology on behalf of the person who did the betrayal, to have a very heartfelt apology, sincere apology, and to have them kind of go back, and you're facilitating this apology. And then in the third phase, you're trying to reconsolidate what's the frayed bond, So you're helping the person who was betrayed being able to express acceptance of the apology. Now, that doesn't mean everything's 100% back to where they were before, and that means they forgive and forget, and you don't hold them accountable. But for the acceptance of the apologist just means that I accept that you are sorry for what you did. But, actual reconciliation can take time in terms of witnessing, behaviors. And I always tell my couples, the worst thing trust is the most fragile thing in the world. Because when it is broken, the only way to restore it is to not do something for long enough that the other person kind of, is able to let it go. But when is that? It's not like you can just go do something. You can do certain things that might help, like, I don't know, give your partner your password to your phone or your email or whatever, depending what the betrayal is. That'll help. But it's by not doing something for long enough that you get trust. And so, so even if you help facilitate the acceptance of the apology, it doesn't mean that we're totally 100% back to square one. It just means I'm accepting it and I'm willing to continue being in this relationship, working towards building safety, building a healthier relationship. So there's a very specific way that they work on repairing attachment injuries. And this is very important work if there's been an affair, if there has just been any sense of betrayal on the part of one or both partners. And I have had situations where both come in with attachment injuries. So we're doing a lot of this in the beginning to just help them get to a place where we can do the work of, reestablishing safety as the default setting in the relationship. But if there have been attachment injuries, you can't necessarily do the general EFT approach and really create a strong sense of safety in the relationship until this is dealt with. So in terms of the EFT family therapy, it's very, very similar to what we just discussed. Most of what was the couples approach. So just a few differences here. One is with families, you'll often find some pretty rigid patterns of how the parent and the child relate to one another. So you're looking for that. I think the most significant difference is when you're working with a couple, both parties are considered equally responsible for creating the emotional safety. But when you're working with families, it is primarily the parent's job to create the emotional safety, to take the lead, to take the risk, the emotional risk, right? Because the parents, it's definitely a hierarchical relationship. And so the parents are responsible for creating the safety, not obviously 100% because but that they definitely have to take the lead and the primary responsibility for that. And I swear to God, I have had parents come in and they were like, I'm not gonna, repair this relationship until my kid, basically makes me feel safe. I'm like, that's not how it works. So you will meet parents who really feel like until the kid starts, being respectful and makes me feel safe, I'm not gonna lift a finger here. And that's just not an approach that will work. So the parents are responsible for creating that safety. And it's our job to help parents understand that that is their responsibility. And they can't sit there with their arms crossed waiting for respect to just flow out of the child. They're the ones who are going to have to put down their armor, put down the weapons and create the safety. Looking at developmental differences, and assessing those when we look at attachment patterns in families, looking at generational influences on attachment, because there's often an intergenerational process around attachment. We typically learn our attachment patterns in our family of origin. So just even tracking those patterns across generations can be very fascinating to look at who's replicating what type of pattern. So, and another thing you'll see is that in the treatment process with families, they will often, work with the family together, but they'll often work with dyads. They might work with just the couple, or they might work with just one parent and one child. So depending on what attachment bonds need to be repaired. So they'll do dyads, they'll do the whole family together, and they'll mix it up a little bit to work on repairing the various bonds in the family. So let's talk about EFT on telehealth. So in terms of telehealth, and I would say this is true for all of the humanistic experiential approaches, I think most of us will agree that doing these emotionally focused interventions, emotionally based interventions, experiential interventions are just tougher on telehealth. And the main reason is that we have so many fewer nonverbals to work with. So I remember during the pandemic, when I had to put all my clients online, I do work with couples. I use a lot of methods that are, like EFT, and I use my unifying framework has a lot of EFT-like interventions in it as well. And it was surprisingly difficult to do enactments on telehealth. And what I realized when I first started doing telehealth with couples was like when you do, especially couples therapy in the room, and also true with individuals and families, but I think it's most palpable with couples. Like there is a vibe in the room. And I know I'm from California and we talk about our vibes and everyone makes fun of us here in California, but oh my God, when you're with a couple, you can feel when someone gets triggered. And what's interesting is, unless they have a face that immediately shows it, there's usually a 10 to 30-second delay or more before you can see it on a computer, on telehealth. And so being aware of that, and that's one of the, if I'm going to do couples therapy, on telehealth, I have a special part of my informed consent, which is because we're not in a room together, I will not, there is this 10 to 30 second delay, which is a lot of time in couples therapy when they're starting to escalate. Trust me, that is a huge loss. And so I do make my clients raise their hand, just like the woman in the picture here. Raise your hand when you're triggered, because I can't even wait 10 to 30 seconds to figure it out by the time you're saying something pretty hurtful across to your partner. So that is the hardest part. Now, it can be done with lower conflict couples. If you have high conflict couples, especially if there's any history of emotional or physical abuse, they're probably not good candidates for telehealth, because you have to be able to manage the conflict. And I once did have a couple who they did fine for like on and off for a year. We worked together, but it escalated to a point, and there were substances involved. And there was a gun in the house I knew about. So I'm like, no, we are not doing telehealth. If I cannot stabilize you. So the one thing I would say with EFT or with couples, if you're going to do telehealth, you have to be able to stabilize them while they're on the screen. So I do have them raise their hand, and it ended up being an incredible intervention because they started to self-regulate. They started to be the ones who are like, they're at home without me, right? And then one person just raises their hand. I'm triggered. And okay, let's pause. Let's talk about what's going on or take a break. So it ended up being really beautiful, and they did more self-regulation without me there than people who only saw me in person. But you do want to be careful around this. So you're going to have to create safety in the room. You need to monitor each person's engagement and really working on your therapeutic presence. And so making sure that, you are well lit. It's funny, I know I've debated with various of my colleagues about, this is my therapy background that you're looking on right now. It is my face, very little in the background. It's not totally stark, but there's not a lot there. And that's so that they feel like they are connected to me. And so you need to be, hopefully have you're going to have to be expressive when you're talking with them. I often will use my hands like you're seeing here. But they can see my face very well. They see only my face. There's no room that they're seeing. There's no blurred background. But you need to be able to have a strong therapeutic presence on the screen to do this type of work, to do this, things like getting into the primary emotions, using your voice to get them, to get in touch with their emotions. And so you can definitely do it online. And you want to do more checking in with people. How was that? How are you feeling right now? Because you just don't have enough nonverbals. I'll tell you a quick hilarious story. At least I thought it was really funny. I was working with a couple, and I had helped the couple get into some really painful emotions around what had happened with a very traumatic event with one of their children. And I know I had this very highly accomplished man, a serious scientist, right? So very, very logical, very together, highly accomplished professionally. And, in this session, I really touched on those vulnerable emotions. There's a lot of tears. And at the end, asking how was that, and I said, did I do okay? Because you want to check in. What was that like? Because it's different when you're doing it, on telehealth, and you want to make sure. And I said, if I were in the room, I would be a little bit better, at being able to rejoin. I just need to check in. How are you doing? Because this was a very, deep session. They're like, oh, if in the room you read me better, I don't want to see you in person. But I do check in with people when we have kind of emotionally intense sessions. I will do it in person, but I'm much more conscientious and diligent about doing it online, because you don't have half the nonverbals to understand what just happened and how they're processing it. So definitely you'll do a lot more checking in, especially when you have those more intense emotions with your clients. And then finally, we want to look at just diversity applications when using EFT. They have done a lot of research in terms of using EFT with diverse populations, especially in terms of racial, ethnic diversity. And there has been a specific approach kind of adapted for working with Latinx clients. But just remember this, all emotional expression is guided by our dominant cultural discourses about how emotions are expressed And there usually are very different rules for men versus women in a given society. And so you need to be very conscious of, how you're coaching clients to express their emotions, what you're expecting from them. I've done a lot of time doing live supervision behind a mirror. And oftentimes, especially newer clinicians will sometimes look at a client and say, oh, they don't seem very sincere. That doesn't seem very, fill in the blank, right? Because the person's expressing the emotions differently. And so you really want to be cognizant of what kind of standard you're applying, where you're getting the idea of what that looks like, because emotions are very much, the appropriate expression of emotion is very much culturally defined. And so you want, people from more individualistic cultures like the United States or Europe, Northern Europe specifically, are often going to have a more restrained approach. People from communal cultures will often have a more expressive approach to emotions. And there's a huge spectrum of healthy expression of norms. And so you want to really be careful that, you're not applying like one single set. And I've seen people often take kind of the humanistic or, a very Rogerian approach to expressing emotions in a very, demonstrative way, and kind of pathologize people unnecessarily, because it's like, nope, this is how a Midwestern, male might express their emotions. This is culturally normal. It's just a lot, not as broad, it's more narrow. Just even regions within the United States, how people express their emotions in Southern California versus New York versus the Midwest versus Florida is different. And so just being aware of that. Now, in terms of just the concept of attachment, it has been studied cross-culturally since 1967. And so if you remember the, Bowlby research, but the general consensus is that attachment needs, the need for emotional safety is pretty universal, pretty consistent across cultures. Now, what it looks like and how it is expressed across cultures can be very different, but there is this universal need. I like to say humans are herd animals. We need to have a safe group of humans to self-regulate. I mean, our brains are literally wired. We didn't get into it in this workshop, but the mirror neurons, we are wired to help regulate one another. And so we are herd animals that need emotional safety. And then this is a pretty hardwired part of being human. So, but being very conscious in terms of working cross-culturally, working and look, even with the gender norms, we can have very specific rules for emotional expression, and to really be careful about not rigidly applying these gender norms. And EFT has been used with successfully with same-sex couples, and the focus is on the same exact attachment needs, which have been identified as universal. But again, you're going to be also attending to societal discourses that add an extra burden typically to those relationships. And so working with EFT, across cultures, with diverse clients, with LGBTQ clients, you're going to be focusing on the attachment needs, but being very careful on any assumptions that you're going to use about how emotions and safety should be expressed based on a number of these variables. So, okay, that is your introduction to emotionally focused therapy. I hope this kind of helped you kind of wrap your brain around what it is. And for those of you here with me live, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hop into Q&A, looking for some questions. So if you've got questions and you happen to be attending this live, feel free to put those in. But yeah, so let's see here. Yeah, so someone is talking about the nagging partner is only for female presenting pursuers. It is not. It is a stereotype that a lot of women get. And so, and the pursuing doesn't always take the form of nagging, but that is statistically, I guess, one of the most common ones. You'll certainly see it in the literature, but yeah, it is, you want to be careful. I try not to use that word with my clients, to use that term of the nag. But sometimes clients use it. Sometimes they have a sense of humor about it. So if they have a positive way to use the word, I will use whatever word they want to use. And I think that's really important. But I was joking about that. And I hope that, yes, but that is the standard. So yes. So awesome. Awesome. Yeah, so use the language that the clients both agree on to describe each person's half of the cycle. Let's see, I got a question here. When working with a family, but it's not children, but adolescents or adults, does it change things? That's a great question. So I would say not significantly. I mean, unless the parents are now, I mean, once the parents need to be caretaken by the adult children. So when you get into really later life, when we're talking 65, 70, and 80, then probably the adult children might need to be, they're probably in the better position to create the emotional safety. Once you have parents who are more dependent on the children, when that role flips. But otherwise, even with, because I'm working with a family now that's got, children in their 20s, and still though, I'm having the parents are still more in charge of creating the emotional safety. Obviously, there's less distance between them, so less hierarchy, and the kids can take more responsibility, but I still put that their competent parents are still in charge. And so in that type of system, I would definitely still have the parents take the lead in recreating the safety in the system. Great question. Okay, Hillary likes the raise your hand. It really worked well. I was surprised. I did it out of desperation in the early days of the pandemic, but it turned out to be super therapeutic. You just never know, right? Thank you, thank you. Okay, yes, I am retiring. Thank you for your congratulations there. Yeah, someone's saying also, yeah, the one with the greater power in the relationship carries the greater responsibility. As someone was saying that they noticed in Dr. Johnson's video, she often touches clients, particularly the female partner. Is this recommended or is it more her style? Well, it depends who you ask, but I think most attorneys would not recommend we touch our clients. But it is certainly something like Virginia Satir, and we have Sue Johnson. I hadn't noticed that so much in her videos, but that is possible. And so if you have the right relationship, you can typically do it. And so, but it's not something I would say blanket across everyone. It's totally safe to do it. Sue Johnson does it. You can do it. You want to get formal training, I think, in the approach before you just want to avoid that. So thank you, everyone. So one person is saying, can one use emotionally focused couples therapy to be used when a partner wants an open marriage? I mean, I think you can use these principles, with an open marriage. Absolutely. I mean, again, both parties need to be in agreement. And actually, it's one of the few models I can think of off the top of my head where, if you want to have some type of open relationship, my experience in working with couples with open relationships, there really has to be a very formal structure. Doing a case-by-case basis did not work well, but having a very formal set of structures to work with. But I think with an open marriage, the focus on creating that secure attachment is a great guiding principle for a relationship, where you're trying to do something as difficult as having an open marriage. So awesome. Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed this. I'm glad you enjoyed my books. Thank you. I'm getting some, let's see, someone's asking, can you give us more tips on ways we can connect in teletherapy for EFT or any other therapy? I just think, for EFT, you really want to, I mean, if you want to do telehealth with something like EFT, you have to be very emotionally present. You need to be emotionally expressive and responsive. They need to be able to read your emotions very clearly. And so it takes a lot of, I think, leadership. And it's not necessarily about what you're saying, it's leadership by how you're being in the relationship. So okay, someone's asking for the latest book, and I know I purchased it, read it, and what the title is, I cannot tell you, but she has a 2022 or 2023 book out right when I was updating my Mastering Competencies for the 4th edition. So I would just go to go to your bookstore, your online bookstore, and look for her latest. She does have an updated book that covers individual, couple, and family in one book. So that is definitely, yeah. Someone's asking, are we still working on the national testing reconstruction? I certainly am. I'm trying to get that article is almost done. So yes, we are definitely working on that. Someone's saying, if the pursuer becomes drained and the withdrawer becomes the pursuer, is this a relationship salvageable? Yeah, foreseeably, it's possible. It's possible. It's never a good sign when the original pursuer in the relationship gets burned out. That's never good because you've got a lot of attachment injury there. And there's usually more than one that you're going to need to work through. And that's where understanding attachment injury and how to work with that is really important. I'll say recently I saw a couple, and I could tell that they tried to repair the attachment and I can just tell repairing the attachment injury is going to be tough just because of how they presented around it. It's going to be a tough sale. But it is a real core component to getting a relationship back on track. Thank you. Aw, thank you, Andrea. She called me a legendary soul. I love it. Thank you. Well, hopefully, well, wait, I just saw a whole bunch of questions here. I need to go back and get these. Okay. Can EFCT work for couples wanting an open marriage? I did answer that. Awesome. Okay, is there a book from Sue Johnson? Okay, I got that one too. Awesome. Briefly, if possible, what are the biggest differences between EFT and imago therapy? I'll be honest. I'm not in a great place to answer that question because I am not trained in imago. I'm trained in EFT and IVCT. But imago is, I can say this. Here's what I can say. EFT is working with in the present moment and fixing the relationships between the couple right now, where imago does a lot more going back to the past. And so EFT is much more present focused. Imago is going back to the past. And the truth is, early in my career, I met a therapist who said they did imago and they were not a good therapist. So I just started with a negative bias. It's not in any of our textbooks. But no, imago can be a great couples therapy approach, but the way I got trained and introduced was not the warmest and fuzziest introduction. Is EFT useful for premarital counseling for low conflict couples? Absolutely, because I think helping couples understand that the name of the game in couples relationship is emotional safety. So when I'm working with premarital couples, I really have them identify what their pattern is. It's good. Their conflict pattern is going to be there from the beginning, right? So I'm going to have them identify that early on, get to know it really well, understand their dance moves and how they handle it, how to, the metaphor I use is that cycle is like this vortex that has this gravitational pull, like a black hole when you're together long enough. And I'm always like, whoever's got more of their prefrontal cortex on is going to throw a lifeline and try to pull the other person out of the vortex. So you don't slip into that negative cycle. I once had a couple that could literally, they were together for over 30 years, 32, 36 years. They were together a long time. They had an argument and they actually verbalized what each person was doing and thinking about them. And when I went back and kind of assessed what was going on, they didn't speak a word to one another. They did not speak a word, but boy, they knew she was mad about this and he was mad about that. And he thought this and she thought that. And you would have assumed that they had I was just, my jaw was on the floor. So the sooner you can identify that pattern, understand what your partner does when they feel their attachment is threatened, and to have compassion for that, the better able you're going to be to actually respond to that in a more effective way. So Alexander's asking, is EFT contraindicated when it comes to other addictions, porn, behavioral, etc.? So I would say it's contraindicated if there is an addiction that is affecting the relationship. Most of them are. Throw gambling in there. Don't forget that one. And the person's not willing to work on it. So if the partner's not willing to work on an addiction that is directly affecting the couple relationship or even indirectly, right? then that's probably not the best scenario, because one person has this escape valve that they're using to kind of avoid often doing the work. Great question. Does EFT work effectively with kids? Why or why not? So certainly with kids and parents, yes, absolutely. And I use the concepts of secure attachment with my teenagers and helping them understand even friendships, as well as their relationship with parents and certainly their dating relationships, right? And good dating relationship partners versus, not. If they're feeling really insecure, not good, people. So I use it with kids and their parents, of course. With families, I do whole lectures on this. But secure attachment is one of the most important things you can do when working built with a family. Like if you don't have that with family, it doesn't matter how you're reinforcing behaviors if you don't have that secure attachment. So I do use it with kids, but often with their parents. Okay. So a question is, if the pursuer becomes drained, Oh yeah, we answered this. Thank you. You put it in both places. At first, no one had questions in the Q&A, and then it filled up. Oh, can you speak a little bit more about changing the tango for complex cycles? So complex cycles is that figure eight, often indicative of trauma. So what that means, you're going to have trauma treatment, often, and often that person is going to be in individual therapy to work on some of the trauma, process some of the trauma, so that they can stay emotionally present when working with their partner. So hopefully that helps, Pamela. Anonymous, can you see my questions? I think I got your questions now. Love Sense is Sue Johnson's more recent book, and it's more for the general audience. There is another book that is for professionals. Okay. Oh, please tell us more about your new projects. So yeah, my latest project, it'll take me a good decade, I'm pretty sure, is I'm developing a unifying framework for psychotherapy that kind of synthesizes all the different theories into a single framework for doing. So I'm working on a book on that right now. I'm working on an article, and I am teaching live classes to teach people how to do this. But my unifying framework, I will say, has there's many parallels with EFT. I have a deep respect for EFT. And the work that they are doing, especially with couples and families. There's so much good here, and I really like a lot of what Sue Johnson does. So thank you. But yeah, my latest, so you can find that at therapythatworksinstitute.com. If you and just so you know, if anyone listening is in my Laughter Way to Licensure course, you will not only get this video without the YouTube ads, you'll also get the handouts there, or if you're in my Clinician Connection membership for the general clinicians, you get the handouts there. I don't give them out on Zoom. So, but hopefully, yeah, that is where you will find that. So one more question here. So what level of addiction being addressed is appropriate before EFT becomes acceptable when working when addiction is present? Wow. It's, I would think the addiction needs to be in control enough, or managed well enough, so that the person is able to really get in touch with their more vulnerable emotions without spiraling into addiction. You have to be able to withstand a certain amount of vulnerability in order to and not use your addictions to escape the scary emotions, I'll just call them. It's not comfortable. It is not comfortable to be in an intimate relationship, okay? Because you are vulnerable. And if you're going to go use your addiction every time you start to feel, vulnerable, then that would be kind of the litmus test as to whether or not. So generally, I would say the addictions need to be pretty much under control, and that you're able to tolerate the intensity of emotional vulnerability without reverting to an addiction to numb you. How's that? How's that sound? Great. Awesome. I am so glad Selena from Korea has enjoyed my books. I know Cengage somehow has translated a lot of my books into Korean. They don't even tell me about it, but I have seen them online and such. Awesome. I'm glad you in Empress Tiffany Elliott. Good to see you here, Tiffany. I'm glad this was a good refresher for you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. And I'm going to actually quickly jump over here and make sure, okay, nothing's going, yeah, so I don't have any questions coming in here on YouTube. Okay, So I wish you all the best. Oh, okay. Now everyone who's lived in Korea is connecting here on the live chat. But thank you so much. I wish you all the best, and I hope you feel you understand adult attachment and EFT a little bit better. It is certainly a very valuable approach in the 21st century. So thank you, everyone. Be well. Take care. For those attending live, this will be up on YouTube in the next couple of days. Take care.